welcome to another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? I'm your host, Karen E. Osborne, and I'm excited about my guest today, whose book comes out in 1 week.
Oh no, 1 week!
That's Maggie Smith. Let me tell you a little bit about Maggie, and then she's going to tell you about her book and how you can get a hold of it and why you should get a hold of it. So Maggie is a podcaster, she's a photographer, and her debut novel is Truth and Other Lies, described as The Devil Meets Prada meets All the President's Men. Amid a wave of wonderful reviews that just stood out for me was this description: an engaging and topical tale of politics and journalistic ethics with a feminist slant. So welcome, Maggie.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one of the things that we like to do is talk about other books. We're going to talk about your book, but we want to talk about other books that you enjoy. So what's sitting on your nightstand? What are you in the middle of reading these days?
Well, it's been interesting because I keep picking up, I mainly read on a Kindle just because I'm running out of room on my bookshelf, like a lot of people. And I found myself in the last couple of months, I guess it has to do with my debut, I'll pick something up and I'll read about 50 pages and I'll go, I don't know, I'm not engaged. So I do have a lot of things that I've started. The ones I made a list of that I will be going back to is The Red Hunter. It's an old one by Lisa Unger. And I had taken a class from her this summer, so I really liked her. And I've started reading a lot of her back stories that I haven't read before. So I'm reading that. It's kind of more of a psychological suspense. I started reading The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict, and that's about the woman that became the librarian for J.P. Morgan. And she's a Black woman, or maybe mixed race, but anyway, I think she's hiding the fact she's Black. And I was reading that for book club, and then I couldn't go to the book club, so I kind of, stopped reading it, but I'll be getting back to that one. And then I'm also reading A Drop in the Ocean by Jenny Ogden. And that was a big award winner a couple of years back. I think it came out in 2020. And she's in Australia. And a friend of mine recommended that really highly. And she won, like, I think one of maybe the Sarton Award or one of those big awards for women's fiction. So it's a woman that's starting over again and kind of takes off on a whim to go to Australia and live on the beach. So maybe that's an escapist or something that I'm trying to get away from all this book publicity stuff. But I'm enjoying that because it's a totally different, I don't usually read that kind of stuff. So
yeah, that sounds so intriguing. I have a dear friend, Willa Hogarth, who just finished a book about a couple who's decided they're Australian, and they just decided to chuck everything, leave Sydney, and go live on the beach, and all of the interesting and intriguing and unanticipated things that
always
happened.
Because otherwise, where's the story?
Where's the story? That's right. So is there a book that you read from? Well, you already gave us a couple of them already, but are there any books that is not on your nightstand that you would recommend to our?
Well, I always, excuse me, I always recommend Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believer. It was a big seller a few years ago, I think. And I kind of think this is the great American novel that everybody says, when's somebody going to write the great American novel? And was that Faulkner, and was that, F. Scott Fitzgerald? And I really think it was Rebecca Mackay only like 3 or 4 years ago. It takes place in Chicago during the AIDS crisis. And it follows a group of people that are close friends and in their 20s and 30s. And some of them do catch AIDS and die. But it's a real uplifting book, and it's quite long, but it really is a great book. And then I read a lot in the psychological suspense genre. And a book from a few years ago, she's now in her fourth book, and this was her first book. And she's a British author. Her name's Claire McIntosh. It's hard for me to pronounce this, but Claire McIntosh, and it's called I Let You Go. And it is one of the best twists early on in the book, like on page 75. I actually, sometimes I'll read a book and I'm marking things I know I'm marking things, but things I want to remember and go back to read again. And I actually wrote in the margins on page 75, oh my goodness gracious, exclamation, exclamation. And I gave it to a friend and she said, I got to that same part and I said, oh, I see what she means. And you'll see it in the reviews. Nobody's given it away, but they're all saying, oh, you won't imagine what's coming on page, at the end of chapter, whatever it is. It really is. Now everyone's going to go buy it.
Everyone's going to go buy it. Thank you, Maggie. This is great. This is great. So tell us a little bit about your writing journey and how you came to be a debut novelist.
At my age, you want to say, right?
No, because I'm so much older than you, and I was a debut novelist 4 years ago, so okay. We're young.
Well, I have had a varied career. I got a PhD in psychology and worked for a couple of years as a psychologist. Then I got married and moved and started an art business, and I ran that for years and years. And then I had somebody offer to buy that business. So I thought, well, what am I going to do next? And I had been looking around for a creative outlet of some kind. And I took a writing workshop, and that kind of interested me. I had started out when I first started college in journalism and thought I would be that kind of writer, a news reporter. And interestingly, that is part of what my novel has to do is that world. But that was kind of, I've tried painting and I'm a terrible singer. So I knew I wouldn't be able to do those kind of creative outlets. So I thought, oh, writing, I could probably do writing. So about 4 years ago, I went to a writing retreat, and they said the prompt that the teacher gave at the beginning of the class was, I could never write a book about, fill in that blank. And I put mothers and daughters. And when it came time to tell why I'd picked that, I said, well, I haven't had any children of my own, although I have had stepchildren through the years. And I did not have a good relationship with my mother. The mother-daughter relationships in which you call their mother every day are just like foreign territory to me. It's like my mother and I did not get along, I think, from the day I hit the world. But it didn't go well with us. And she has died subsequently, so I'm kind of over that. But I mean, she wasn't physically abusive, but not loving and not close to her. So that's what, of course, I wound up writing about, was mothers and daughters looking for role models that weren't their mother, which was kind of what I was going through as I was going through my growing up years and into my college years. Was just kind of, I don't want to model myself after my mother, so who else is out there? And that's a little bit of the theme of the book.
Wow. And so that's part of what else? So your journalism is in there. The mother-daughter relationship is in there.
Journalism is in there. Well, the differences in generations are in there too, and that was interesting to play around with, because I have only one point of view character, and that's the 25-year-old. That's kind of me at 25. But her mother is around 49, 50, and she's running for office for the first time, a political office. She's actually running all the way to Congress. As the protagonist says, like, she couldn't just run for county treasurer. It's like, I'm going to Congress. And she makes some remark to her mother like, what makes you've never held elective office in your life? And her mother says, nowadays that's not a negative. And then an
That's
older
true.
woman that is about 65, that is kind of at the end of her career. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is I have a stepdaughter who is about 24, 25. And so I've been able to interact with someone in that millennial generation. And then I know people that are older that, are at the end of their careers. And so I was playing around with that baby boomer millennium and the middle, whatever they call them,
Gen Xers,
generation,
Gen
Gen
Xers.
X's, and how our needs and our wants change over time as we get older. Because the oldest woman, the famous woman, I tell people, think of her as like Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters famous, not
Mm.
just famous in her own little world, but in the world in general. Um, she is accused of an ethics violation, and feels as though everything can get taken away from her, and that she's worked so hard all her life to build up this reputation and to build up her standing. And now this happens to be happening on Twitter. Um, all this can be taken away from her in just a few days with the
Yeah.
speed of social media nowadays. So there's social media aspects. There's one scene that's kind of it isn't a Me Too book by any means, but it's got one scene that has a Me Too theme in it. And you see it's not so much the Me Too as you see the difference between the 65-year-old and the 25-year-old in their reaction to this man.
Uh,
Because the 65-year-old is kind of saying, hey, you use what you can get. He's got power, he can do your career a lot of good. And the 25-year-old is saying, I'm not having anything to do with that man. Um, so I think that's also something that you see in the workplace, you see in families, is how different generations view social issues differently.
yes, yes. Oh, that sounds so intriguing. And this is all wrapped up in a psychological thriller.
No, it's not a
No?
psychological thriller. It's a woman's fiction,
A women's fiction.
contemporary women's fiction. And it's very much of a 25-year-old finding her role model and her relationship with this older journalist and her mother as the two role models in kind of effect she's forced to choose between because of the plot.
Mm, mm. Well, this sounds very, very intriguing. Did
And,
you're a
and I would say there's not a lot of politics. A lot of people in reviews are saying, "Oh, I don't want to read this because I just have had enough of politics." Other than the fact the mother is running for office, and so there is some parts of that. It really has very little to do with politics. So don't not buy it because of that.
don't not buy it because of that.
Exactly.
That's right. So you're also a photographer.
I
Did that
am.
play any role in your writing journey?
Other than I think it's very much, I took that up before I took up writing as a hobby. And that was partly because I was in the art field. And so I was selling artwork. And although I can't paint, I have a good eye from years and years of being in that field. I can kind of say, oh, that's not, over here is a better view, or
Mhm.
up here is a better view than down here. So I have an eye for that. And so that made photography be of interest to me. And I think, other than the fact, noticing, um, you
Yes.
know, details, and also not necessarily going with your first instinct. Uh, Photography teachers will
Mm.
often say, don't take the first shot you think of. Just think about it a little while, move around, get up on a ladder, get down on the ground, do it from behind. Just look at all the different ways you can take this shot.
Mm.
And that's also, it's usually, if you take a class and you're with like 8 other photographers or something, and then you're sharing your work at the end of the night, that's often the interesting part, is you all went to the same places and you all took such different pictures. And that's the same with writers. You could say there's only 3 plots or 8 plots or 15 plots, and everybody just keeps writing them, but we all keep writing them in a different way.
But
um,
also, it makes me think, Maggie, of your just the point you made earlier about the different generations and how they look at things differently,
right, right.
and that your so perhaps your photography opened your mind to being able to have people look at things. But I think that everyone should take a photography. Every writer should take a photography class.
Or get a PhD in psychology, because that does the same thing.
That helps too. But the other one's easier.
Yeah, it is.
And finally, I did want to ask you about your podcast, Hear Us Roar.
Well, that was an idea I had about 3+ years ago. I belong to the Women's Fiction Writers Association, because that's, at least this first book is women's fiction. And podcasts were just now coming into play. I mean, you were hearing about them, but they weren't as everywhere as they are now. And I kind of approached the board of directors and said, it might be fun to have a podcast where we put people on from our association, and I'd be glad to be the host. And they said, well, since we're all volunteers and you seem to be volunteering, step right up. So I did, and I went out and bought equipment and learned about podcasting. And at the beginning, it was kind of slow go. I was asking people to be on, and I was doing it twice a month. And then after about a year, our population in the association grew. So when I joined, we were 500 people, and now we're 1,700 people. And so we have a lot bigger population, and it got more popular, and podcasting got more popular. And then people could listen to it and they could say, oh, well, that wasn't so bad. I could probably do that. And so probably a year in, I looked at the list of people on the waiting list and thought, I better start doing this once every week, not twice a month. I'll never get to the end of this list. And even still, I have probably 30 people on the list waiting. So they don't get it the day they publish. They usually I take it in order of publication. And they're all members of that association. And it's when they bring out their debut novel. And it has to be women's fiction, because we do have some members that write other kind of genres as well.
What a wonderful gift to debut authors, though. That's wonderful.
It's great for them. It's great for me in terms of building my platform and learning a lot through. We're now at 126 people I've interviewed. So I've talked to that many people about what worked for them, what didn't work for them, how they found a publisher or an agent or didn't. Some of them indie published. So it's been a great learning process for me. And it's been good for the association to get the word out about them. It's a great outreach program as well.
Yeah, that sounds so good.
Kind of win-win-win.
Well, I do find that authors seem so helpful to each other. It's such a generous community.
It
where
is.
People, they'll do manuscript swaps, they'll write reviews for each other, they give tips. People have a problem, they jump in and say, well, here's what worked for me. I just find it to be a very generous community.
Do you think every artistic community is like that? Because I kind of get the sense that maybe actors are like that too. We think of them as being competitive because they do compete for roles. But when you hear them talk, they're always pretty generous about other people and wanting to work with particular people and supportive of it. Maybe that's just a facade, but musicians seem to be very open to collaborations. Yeah, maybe it's just the artistic nature of.
Yeah, it could be. They do convey, kind of put us out there as more cutthroat in the media. If there's a story about a writer, then the writer is stolen from somebody, or
I guess. Yeah.
They don't paint us always as the generous community that we are. So I'm going with your thought that artists in general are good people who are willing to help other people.
Maybe almost everybody out there is good people, actually, whether they're artists or not.
So where can our audience find you?
Well, I have a website, which is pretty easy to remember. It's maggiesmithwriter.com. I'm not the woman in England, and there is a famous poet called Maggie Smith who's writing currently, and she is Maggie Smith Poet, so I am maggiesmithwriter.com. I hang out a lot on Instagram as Maggie Smith Writes, so a little bit different take on it. And my book is available lots of places as of March 8th. including all the online retailers, hopefully some independent bookstores. I'm on IndieBound and Bookshelf.org, so if you want to support local through that venue, you can. So I'm on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and those other online outlets as well.
Excellent, excellent. This has been such a pleasure talking with you, Maggie. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, all of you who are watching. One of the things I just want to remind you is how helpful it is to authors like Maggie, like myself, when you do read and you enjoy, to write a review in all those places that Maggie mentioned. You could put the same review on each
Copy and
site.
paste.
But reviews really help us so much, and positive reviews. If you don't like the book, then just write us personally. Tell us privately. We thank you in advance for buying Maggie's book, for reviewing Maggie's book. I thank you in advance for all of you who have bought and reviewed Tangled Lies and Getting It Right. And we will see you next time at What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing?